I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. The book of Zephaniah starts with a warning that destruction is coming. It begins to list the nations that will be destroyed, starting with the Israelite nation of Judah, and then moving to non-Israelite nations. The prophecy about Judah is separated from the prophecies of the other nations by a description of the day of the Lord. Zephaniah places importance on the great day of the Lord. And one would think that the day of the Lord would be a day of celebration, a day of joy and gladness. But Zephaniah, like many of the minor prophets, describes the day of the Lord as bloody, with much death and destruction. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin. The destruction that the nations see is brought on by themselves. The day of the Lord will be a day of disaster because they have sinned against the Lord. This judgment is felt by Judah as well as the other nations and shows God's judgment over all of creation. The judgment against Judah is specifically idolatry. Some worship the Lord while also worshiping false gods, and some have given up seeking the Lord altogether. The Israelites are no longer a holy nation of the Lord. The other nations maintain a false sense of security. God brings up the pride of these nations. Specifically to Assyria, God says this is a carefree city that lived in safety. She said to herself, I am, and there is none besides me. What a ruin she has become, a lair for wild beasts. These nations believe that their power protects them from ever falling. But the day of the Lord will humble even the most powerful earthly kingdoms. After describing the sins of the other nations, Zephaniah abruptly switches to Jerusalem, lumping it in with the other nations. Jerusalem is failing to live holy, failing to live set apart and distinct from the other nations. Instead, they have become undistinguishable from the other nations in its oppression and in its sin. But through this punishment and judgment, we see that God's desire is not for destruction. God's desire is for the healing of the nations. Zephaniah's description of the disastrous day of the Lord ends with saying, gather together, O shameful nation. Before the day of the Lord's wrath comes upon you, seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. This announcement of judgment is not what seals the fate of the cities. They are pleaded with to hear this pronouncement and to react to it. God is saying, this is what will happen to you if you keep going down this unrighteous road that you are traveling on. Please return to me. Return to righteousness. God says, I said to the city, surely you will fear me and accept correction. Then her dwelling would not be cut off, nor would all my punishments come upon her. But they were still eager to act corruptly in all they did. When God sees unrighteous actions in the world, God first acts to correct them. God desires healing and restoration. God desires a return to righteousness. God wants us to remove the unrighteousness from our lives and return to the righteous ways of God. But if we refuse to remove unrighteousness from our lives, then God will remove it. The book of Zephaniah ends with hope for salvation. God tells of a time when the people of God will choose to accept God's correcting and return to righteousness. God says that my worshippers, my scattered people, will bring me offerings. Zephaniah shows us that God distinguishes between the righteous and the unrighteous. God says, I will remove from this city those who rejoice in their pride. But I will leave within you the meek and humble who trust in the name of the Lord. Although a nation as a whole might be corrupt, God sees those who remain faithful. God sees those who are righteous. When God's anger burns against a nation, the unrighteous nation is overcome. The unrighteous individuals are destroyed, but those who are righteous are preserved. This is why the day of the Lord is both good news and bad news. It is good news of hope for those who are walking in the righteous ways of God, but it produces the fear of destruction for those who choose to walk in unrighteousness. Through Zephaniah, the church is warned of what happens if we choose to step outside of alignment with God. Simply calling ourselves a Christian does not save us from the correcting of God. Living in alignment with God and trusting God is what leads to God's love instead of God's wrath. But unrighteousness is an enemy to God. We have the choice to either live as an ally to God or to live as an enemy to God. God desires us to return to the righteous ways of God, ways of love and justice, ways of healing and restoration. And so we are left with a question. Are you willing to heed Zephaniah's warning and remove unrighteousness from your life? Are you willing to walk in the righteous ways of God in all that you do?